The morning Ethan Walsh disappeared began like any other Tuesday in October 2014, with the sound of school buses rumbling through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. 7-year-old Ethan had pressed his small face against the kitchen window, watching the amber leaves spiral down from the old maple tree in their front yard, his breath fogging the glass in small, perfect circles. His mother, Claire, remembered this detail with startling clarity because it was the last ordinary moment they would ever share. If this story reminds you of a child you once knew who seemed to carry the weight of the world in their eyes, share it with someone who might understand the quiet strength it takes to survive what no child should endure. That afternoon, when Ethan failed to arrive home from Lincoln Elementary School, Claire initially felt only the familiar flutter of maternal concern. Perhaps he'd stayed after for help with math, or maybe he'd lingered at the playground, captivated by the way October light filtered through the changing leaves. She called the school office, expecting to hear Mrs. Henderson's reassuring voice explaining that Ethan was safe in the after-school program she'd forgotten to mention. But Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a different tone entirely. "Mrs. Walsh, Ethan never made it to afternoon classes. We tried calling you around 1:30. The phone records would later show 17 missed calls on Claire's cell phone, all while she'd been in the basement laundry room, the ancient washing machine drowning out everything except the sound of her own humming. She'd been folding Ethan's small t-shirts, running her hands over the soft cotton, thinking about how quickly he was growing out of his clothes, how she'd need to take him shopping for winter jackets soon. The first police officer to arrive was Deputy Marcus Rivera, a young man with kind eyes who knelt down to Ethan's height when examining his bedroom. The room was a 7-year-old's paradise. Action figures scattered across a braided rug, drawings taped to every available wall surface, and a collection of smooth river stones lined up along the windowsill like tiny sentinels. Rivera noted how the drawings all seemed to feature the same recurring elements: houses with crooked chimneys, stick figures with oversized hands, and what appeared to be dark spaces beneath staircases. "Your son likes to draw," Rivera observed, studying a particularly detailed sketch of what looked like a basement or cellar, complete with hanging light bulbs in shadowy corners. Claire nodded, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself. "He's always drawing. Sometimes I find pictures stuffed in his backpack, in his desk, between his mattress and box spring. I used to joke that we were single-handedly keeping Crayola in business. As the hours stretched into evening, more officers arrived. Detective Sarah Kim, a 20-year veteran with the county sheriff's department, took careful notes about Ethan's routine, his friends, his teachers. She paid particular attention to Claire's ex-husband, Daniel Walsh, who lived 43 miles away in Harrisburg and worked as a long-haul trucker. "When did you last see your son?" Detective Kim asked Daniel when he arrived at the house near midnight, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like relief mixed with fear. "2 weekends ago," Daniel replied, his large hands twisting the baseball cap he held in his lap. "He spent Saturday night at my place. We went fishing at Miller's Creek. He caught 3 bluegill." His voice cracked slightly. "Kid was so proud, he made me take pictures of each one before we threw them back." The search began at dawn on Wednesday, with volunteers from 3 counties spreading out across the dense Pennsylvania woodlands that bordered Millbrook. They called Ethan's name until their voices were hoarse, the sound echoing off limestone ridges and disappearing into valleys thick with morning fog. Search dogs followed scent trails that led to the edge of Route 15, then vanished completely, as if Ethan had simply dissolved into the autumn air. For weeks, Claire barely slept. She'd find herself standing in Ethan's doorway at 3 a.m., studying those drawings taped to his walls, wondering what stories they told that she'd never thought to ask about. The stick figures in his pictures all had the same expression, if you could call 2 dots and a curved line an expression, but somehow she'd begun to see something in those simple faces that she'd missed before. A sadness, a watchfulness, a knowledge that seemed too heavy for someone who still believed in the Tooth Fairy. Detective Kim returned frequently during those first months, always with new questions about Ethan's behavior, his drawings, his relationship with various family members. She'd sit at Claire's kitchen table, drinking coffee that had grown cold hours ago, spreading out photocopies of Ethan's artwork like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "Tell me about his drawings again," Kim would say, pointing to a particularly dark sketch of what appeared to be a figure hunched in a corner. "Did he ever talk about what inspired these images?" Claire would shake her head, feeling inadequate as a mother, wondering how many signs she'd missed. "He just drew." All the time. I thought it was normal. Creative kids draw, right? I encouraged it. I bought him art supplies for his birthday, for Christmas. I thought I was being supportive. The investigation consumed the community's attention for months. Millbrook was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the disappearance of one child felt like a wound in the collective heart. Local businesses posted Ethan's school photo in their windows, a gap-toothed smile beneath unruly brown hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets too old for his young face. As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, the active search efforts gradually diminished. Detective Kim continued to follow leads, but phone calls became less frequent, visits more sporadic. Claire learned to live with the particular ache of not knowing, that relentless question mark that followed her through grocery stores, where she'd instinctively reach for Ethan's favorite cereal, through school pickup times when her car seemed to drive itself to Lincoln Elementary out of pure muscle memory. The town began to heal around the wound of Ethan's absence, the way communities always do. But Claire remained suspended in that terrible space between hope and despair, surrounded by a 7-year-old's possessions that she couldn't bear to pack away and couldn't stand to look at. The drawings remained taped to his bedroom walls, silent witnesses to a story she was only beginning to understand. By the first anniversary of Ethan's disappearance, Claire Walsh had learned to navigate the peculiar geography of grief. How to smile at the grocery clerk while buying food she had no appetite to eat. How to nod politely when neighbors asked if there were any updates. How to sleep in a house that felt haunted by the sound of small feet that would never again thunder down the hallway. The memorial service held at Millbrook Community Church drew nearly 300 people, far more than the church's modest sanctuary could accommodate. Mourners spilled out onto the front steps and gathered in the adjacent fellowship hall, where speakers had been set up to carry the service to overflow crowds. Pastor Williams spoke about faith in the face of uncertainty, about holding space for hope even when hope felt impossible. But it was Claire's words that lingered in the minds of those who heard them. Standing at the pulpit, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her cheeks, she spoke not about Ethan's disappearance but about his presence, the way he'd hum while coloring, how he'd arrange his French fries by size before eating them, his habit of collecting interesting rocks and leaving them in unexpected places around the house. "I found one in my purse last week," she said, holding up a smooth piece of quartz that caught the afternoon light filtering through the church's stained glass windows. "He must have put it there months ago, before—" I'd forgotten about his little gifts, how he was always trying to bring beauty into ordinary places. Detective Kim attended the service, sitting in the back pew and observing the crowd with professional interest. She'd never stopped believing that someone in Millbrook knew more about Ethan's disappearance than they were saying. Small towns, she'd learned over 2 decades of police work, were remarkably good at keeping secrets, especially secrets that threatened the community's sense of safety and normalcy. After the service, Kim found herself studying the bulletin board in the church fellowship hall, where Claire had created a display of Ethan's drawings alongside photos from various stages of his short life. The artwork drew Kim's attention once again, those recurring dark spaces, the figures that seemed to be hiding or seeking shelter, the houses that looked more like prisons than homes. "Mrs. Walsh," Kim approached Claire as she was taking down the display. "I wonder if I might ask you something about these drawings again." Claire looked up from carefully peeling tape off the wall. "Of course, though I don't know what else I can tell you. The children in his pictures, did Ethan ever talk about other kids who might have been struggling? Kids at school, maybe, or in the neighborhood?" Claire paused. A drawing of 3 stick figures huddled together in what appeared to be a dark room, still clutched in her hand. He was sensitive to other people's feelings. Sometimes he'd come home from school upset because someone had been picked on, or because a classmate seemed sad. But he never mentioned anything specific, nothing that seemed... She trailed off, staring at the drawing. "What is it?" "This one. I remember when he drew this. It was maybe 2 weeks before he disappeared. I asked him about it because it was so different from his usual pictures. Darker, more detailed. He said it was about the kids who have to be quiet all the time." Claire's voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought he meant kids who got in trouble at school for talking too much. I never thought—" Kim took careful notes, but the lead, like so many others, seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. She interviewed Ethan's teachers again, his classmates, parents, anyone who might have insight into what the kids who have to be quiet all the time could have meant. But 7-year-olds, she discovered, were remarkably literal creatures. When asked about quiet kids, They talked about children who whispered in library voices, or who were shy during show and tell. As the seasons cycled through their familiar rhythms, the brilliant reds and golds of autumn giving way to winter's stark beauty, then spring's cautious green, and summer's lush abundance, Claire found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. She took a part-time job at the County Historical Society, cataloging old photographs and documents that told the stories of families who had lived and died and been forgotten long before Ethan was even born. There was something comforting about the work, about touching paper that had been handled by people decades gone, about reading letters written by mothers to sons who would never return from wars, about preserving the evidence of lives that had mattered to someone, somewhere, sometime. She began to understand that grief, like history, was not a linear progression but rather a series of layers, each one adding depth and complexity to the story. The second anniversary of Ethan's disappearance passed more quietly than the first. Claire held a small gathering at Miller's Creek, the fishing spot where Daniel had taken Ethan on their last weekend together. She, Daniel, Detective Kim, and a handful of close friends stood beside the creek, where bluegill still swam in the shallows, where autumn leaves now drifted on the current like messages written in a language none of them could read. Daniel had aged considerably in the 2 years since Ethan's disappearance. The long-haul trucking job that had once provided him with an escape from his failures as a husband and father now felt like a burden, carrying him farther and farther from the place where his son had last been seen. He'd considered moving back to Millbrook, renting a small apartment near Claire's house, but the thought of being surrounded by memories of Ethan felt both essential and unbearable. "I keep thinking I see him," Daniel confessed to Claire as they stood by the creek. "In truck stops, in diners, walking along highways. Always from behind, always just far enough away that I can't be sure. I've chased down probably 50 kids over the past 2 years, scared their parents half to death." Claire nodded, understanding. She'd had her own phantom sightings, in grocery stores, at the mall, once memorably at a school playground where she'd actually approached a boy who had Ethan's build and coloring, only to see a stranger's face turn toward her with confusion and mild alarm. "I dream about him," she said quietly. "Not nightmares exactly, just ordinary dreams. He's at the kitchen table eating cereal, or we're driving somewhere in the car, and he's telling me about his day. They feel so real that when I wake up, for just a moment I expect to hear him in the next room." As they prepared to leave Miller's Creek, Claire noticed something glinting in the shallows near the bank. She waded in, the cold water soaking through her shoes, and retrieved what turned out to be a small piece of glass, worn smooth by the current and time. Without thinking, she slipped it into her pocket. Another of Ethan's gifts, she told herself, though she knew he'd never touch this particular stone. The gesture felt important somehow, a way of honoring not just Ethan's memory, but his approach to the world, his ability to find beauty and meaning in unexpected places, his instinct to collect small treasures as evidence that wonder still existed, even in the darkest times. Margaret Chin had been teaching art at Jefferson Middle School for 15 years when she first noticed the drawings. It was September 2016, 2 years after Ethan Walsh's disappearance, and she was setting up her classroom for a new school year, when a substitute teacher from the previous spring cleaned out her desk and handed Margaret a manila folder filled with student artwork that had never been returned. "Found these stuck in the back of the supply cabinet," the substitute said apologetically. "Must have gotten mixed up during the end-of-year chaos." Margaret nodded absently, focused on arranging paintbrushes and checking supplies. She'd planned to sort through the folder later, after the immediate demands of lesson planning and bulletin board decoration were complete. But something about the drawings caught her attention as she flipped through them, a distinctive style, a recurring darkness that seemed unusual for middle school work. The name in the corner of each piece read Marcus Rivera, and Margaret vaguely remembered the quiet 8th grader who had transferred to Jefferson halfway through the previous school year. His family had moved to the district from somewhere in Pennsylvania, she recalled, and Marcus had been one of those students who faded into the background, completing assignments competently but never volunteering answers or drawing attention to himself. What struck Margaret most about Marcus's artwork was its sophistication and emotional depth. While his classmates had been creating typical 13-year-old fare, cartoon characters, sports logos, fantastical creatures, Marcus had been drawing detailed interior spaces that felt heavy with unspoken stories. Basement rooms with single hanging bulbs, closets with clothes pushed to one side to create hiding spaces, staircases viewed from underneath as if seen by someone crouched in shadows. But it was the human figures in his drawings that truly disturbed Margaret. Small forms huddled in corners, children's faces turned away or obscured by darkness, hands reaching towards safety that always seemed just out of frame. The technique was remarkable for someone his age, but the subject matter suggested a familiarity with fear that no child should possess. Margaret had seen enough troubled student work over the years to recognize art as a form of silent communication. She'd learned to read the visual language of abuse, neglect, and trauma in the drawings and paintings that crossed her desk. This wasn't the first time a student had used art class as a safe space to process difficult experiences, but something about Marcus's work felt particularly urgent. She made copies of the drawings before returning the originals to Marcus's file, then spent her evening researching art therapy techniques and reviewing the district's protocols for reporting suspected child abuse. The more she studied the images, the more convinced she became that they represented more than just a teenager's dark imagination. The next day, Margaret approached the school counselor, Janet Morrison, with her concerns. Morrison, a veteran counselor who had worked with at-risk youth for over a decade, studied the photocopied drawings with growing alarm. "Where is this student now?" Morrison asked, spreading the drawings across her desk. "That's the problem," Margaret replied. According to his records, Marcus Rivera transferred out of the district at the end of last school year. The family moved again, but there's no forwarding information in his file. Morrison frowned, making notes on a legal pad. That's not unusual for families in crisis. Frequent moves, incomplete records, gaps in school attendance. Do we have any information about where the family lived while they were in our district? Margaret shook her head. I can check with the main office, but I remember he was always being picked up by different people. Sometimes an older woman who might have been his grandmother. Sometimes a man who introduced himself as a family friend. I don't think I ever met his parents. The investigation into Marcus Rivera's background revealed a frustrating pattern of bureaucratic gaps and missing information. The family had rented a small house on Maple Street for approximately 8 months, paying cash for rent and utilities, leaving no paper trail beyond basic utility records. The landlord, when contacted, remembered the family as quiet folks who kept to themselves, but could provide no forwarding address or contact information. Morrison contacted the Department of Children and Families, but without a current address or legal name verification, their ability to investigate was severely limited. Marcus Rivera's school records showed academic competence but also frequent absences, medical appointments that were never specifically detailed, and a pattern of withdrawal from social activities that typically indicated family instability. What haunted Margaret most was the possibility that somewhere, Marcus Rivera was still creating art that documented his experiences, still using pencil and paper to process trauma that no adult in his life was addressing. She found herself studying every missing child report that crossed her desk at school, wondering if any of those faces might belong to the boy whose drawings had revealed such intimate knowledge of fear and hiding. 3 months later, Margaret attended a professional development workshop on recognizing signs of child trafficking and exploitation. The presenter, a federal agent named David Park, showed examples of artwork created by survivors, drawings remarkably similar to those she'd found in Marcus Rivera's file. During the break, Margaret approached Agent Park with photocopies of the drawings. "I found these in my classroom," she explained. "The student who created them transferred out before I could follow up, but something about these images has been bothering me for months." Park studied the drawings with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many similar images. His expression grew increasingly serious as he examined each piece, noting details that Margaret had missed, the precise way shadows fell in the basement scenes, the specific type of restraints suggested by marks on the figures, wrists, and ankles, the architectural details that suggested familiarity with multiple locations. "How old was this student when he created these?" Park asked. 13, according to his school records, though we couldn't verify much about his background. Park was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'd like to keep copies of these, if that's all right with you. And I'll need everything you can remember about this Marcus Rivera. Physical description, behavioral observations, any adults who might have been associated with him." That evening, Margaret sat in her empty classroom long after the janitors had finished their rounds, staring at the blank bulletin boards and neat rows of desks that would soon be filled with new students, new artwork, new opportunities to read between the lines of what children were trying to communicate. She thought about Marcus Rivera, wherever he was now, and wondered if anyone else was paying attention to the stories he was trying to tell. She also found herself thinking about other missing children, other families shattered by disappearances that seemed to have no explanation or resolution. In her desk drawer, she kept a folder of newspaper clippings about local missing persons cases, not from any professional obligation, but from a growing awareness that children vanish from their communities more often than most people realized, and that their stories often went untold simply because there was no one left to tell them. The drawing that stayed with her most vividly was one Marcus had titled "The Quiet Game." It showed a group of small figures sitting in a circle, their hands pressed over their mouths, their eyes wide with what could have been fear or concentration. In the background, barely visible in the shadows he'd created with careful cross-hatching, loomed an adult figure whose face was obscured but whose presence dominated the entire composition. Margaret had worked with children long enough to know that art often revealed truths that words couldn't express, but she'd never encountered work that felt quite so much like evidence of something terrible and ongoing. As she locked her classroom door and walked through the empty hallways of Jefferson Middle School, she found herself hoping that wherever Marcus Rivera was now, someone was finally listening to what he'd been trying to say. Agent David Park had been tracking patterns of child exploitation for 7 years when Marcus Rivera's drawings crossed his desk. But something about the specific details in those images triggered connections he hadn't expected to make. The architectural elements, the way light fell in the basement scenes, the positioning of furniture and fixtures, all of it suggested a familiarity with locations that extended beyond imagination. Park worked out of the Pittsburgh field office, where missing children cases from across Pennsylvania eventually landed on federal desks when local investigations reached dead ends. He'd seen thousands of case files, hundreds of drawings created by survivors, and enough evidence photos to fill several storage units. But Marcus's artwork contained details that reminded him of other cases, other children whose stories had been documented in police reports and FBI files. The first connection came when Park was reviewing cold cases from 2014. Ethan Walsh's file contained photocopies of drawings that bore striking similarities to Marcus Rivera's work. The same perspective from hiding places, the same attention to shadows and confined spaces, the same recurring architectural details. Park spread both sets of artwork across his desk, looking for patterns that might indicate shared experiences or locations. What emerged was troubling. Both children had drawn basement spaces with specific characteristics: concrete walls, exposed ceiling beams, hanging light bulbs positioned at particular angles. Both had depicted staircases viewed from underneath, showing an intimate knowledge of what those spaces look like from the perspective of someone hiding or being hidden. Most significantly, both had drawn adult figures that were consistently obscured or positioned just outside the frame, present but never fully revealed. Park began pulling files of other missing children from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and West Virginia, cases spanning the past 5 years where children had vanished without explanation, where investigations had stalled due to lack of evidence or witnesses. He was looking for any documentation of artwork, any drawings or writings that might indicate patterns of exploitation or trafficking. The process was painstaking. Many case files contained no artwork at all, and others included only family photos or school assignments that revealed nothing about the child's inner experience. But gradually, a disturbing picture began to emerge. 7 children across 3 states had created artwork with remarkably similar themes and details, all before disappearing or transferring schools under mysterious circumstances. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, a forensic psychologist who specialized in child trauma, reviewed the collected artwork at Park's request. Her analysis revealed sophisticated techniques for processing and documenting traumatic experiences, suggesting that these children had developed artistic skills as survival mechanisms. What we're seeing here, Dr. Hoffman explained during a case conference, is consistent with children who have been systematically exposed to exploitation and have learned to communicate their experiences through visual metaphor. The recurring architectural details, the perspective from hiding places, the way adult figures are consistently obscured, all of this suggests organized abuse rather than random victimization. The geographical distribution of the cases revealed another pattern. The affected children had lived in communities connected by major trucking routes: Interstate 81, Interstate 70, Interstate 95. Their families had histories of frequent moves, often with gaps in documentation that made it difficult to track their movements or verify their circumstances. Park requested assistance from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, providing them with copies of all the artwork and asking for analysis of any similar cases in their database. The response came back within 2 weeks. 12 additional children across 8 states had created artwork with similar characteristics before disappearing or becoming lost in the foster care system. The scope of what they were dealing with began to crystallize. This wasn't a single predator or even a small group of offenders. The evidence suggested a network of exploitation that moved children across state lines, using trucking routes and temporary housing to avoid detection by local law enforcement agencies. Agent Rodriguez from the Baltimore Field Office joined the investigation, bringing expertise in trafficking networks and organized exploitation rings. Together, Park and Rodriguez began mapping the movements of missing children, looking for convergence points where multiple cases might intersect. "We're looking for a hub," Rodriguez explained to Park during one of their lengthy case review sessions. "Somewhere central to these trucking routes, where children might be held, processed, or transferred between different handlers." The artwork suggests familiarity with specific physical locations, basement spaces that appear in multiple children's drawings, with too much consistency to be coincidental. The breakthrough came when Park was reviewing property records in counties along major trucking corridors. He was looking for abandoned buildings, storage facilities, or commercial properties that had changed hands frequently during the time frame when children had been disappearing. One property in particular caught his attention, a former trucking depot in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, that had been sold 3 times in 5 years, always to shell companies with minimal documentation. The depot sat on 18 acres of rural property, connected to Interstate 80 by a private access road that would allow large vehicles to come and go without attracting attention from local residents. Satellite images showed several outbuildings in addition to the main facility, and property records indicated that the buildings had been modified extensively since the original construction in 1987. Park drove to Clearfield County on a cold November morning, ostensibly to review the property as part of a routine commercial real estate investigation. What he found matched details from the children's drawings with disturbing accuracy. The main building contained a basement level with concrete walls and exposed ceiling beams. Hanging light fixtures were positioned exactly as they appeared in artwork created by multiple missing children. Smaller rooms off the main basement space had been configured in ways that corresponded to architectural details in the drawings. Most significantly, Park found evidence of recent modifications to the basement spaces. Walls had been altered to create smaller compartments, and there were signs of reinforcement work that seemed designed to contain rather than to store. The building officially sat empty, but Park noticed tire tracks in the parking area that suggested recent activity, and the electrical meter showed power usage inconsistent with an abandoned facility. Park requested surveillance authorization for the property, but knew that gathering evidence sufficient for search warrants would require careful coordination with local law enforcement and child protective services. The scope of the investigation had expanded beyond a simple missing persons case into something that would require resources from multiple agencies and jurisdictions. As he drove back to Pittsburgh that evening, Park found himself thinking about Marcus Rivera, about Ethan Walsh, about all the children whose stories had led him to that basement in Clearfield County. Somewhere, he knew, those children were still creating art, still documenting their experiences, still hoping that someone would pay attention to what they were trying to communicate. The investigation was far from over, but for the first time in months, Park felt like they were moving toward answers rather than just accumulating questions. The patterns were becoming clear, the connections were emerging, and the evidence was building toward something that might finally bring these children home. Eleanor Matthews had worked at the Carnegie Library in downtown Pittsburgh for 32 years, long enough to develop an almost supernatural ability to read the stories behind patrons' faces. She could distinguish between students cramming for finals and parents researching their children's mysterious symptoms, between job seekers polishing resumes, and individuals fleeing situations they couldn't discuss with anyone else. It was this intuition that made her notice the boy who came to the library every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon in the spring of 2023. He appeared to be around 15 or 16, though something about his demeanor suggested he'd experienced more than most adults. He always arrived alone, always chose the same corner table in the art section, and always spent exactly 2 hours working intently on drawings that he never let anyone else see. Eleanor observed him over several weeks before approaching. She'd watched him check out books on architectural drawing, perspective techniques, and art therapy methods. An unusual combination for a teenager, but not unprecedented in a library that served Pittsburgh's diverse population. What concerned her more was his hypervigilance, the way he positioned himself so he could see all the exits, the way he flinched slightly whenever someone moved too quickly in his peripheral vision. "Finding everything you need?" Eleanor asked one Thursday afternoon, settling into the chair across from his table with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent decades putting anxious patrons at ease. The boy looked up from his sketchpad, automatically closing it to prevent her from seeing his work. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." His voice carried traces of an accent that Eleanor couldn't quite place. Something southern, maybe, or Midwestern. His clothes were clean but ill-fitting, the kind of generic garments that suggested they'd been purchased quickly from a thrift store, rather than chosen for style or comfort. "I'm Eleanor," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that somehow seemed natural despite the formal setting. "I've been working here longer than I care to admit, and I always like to get to know our regular visitors." "I'm Marcus," the boy replied, shaking her hand briefly before pulling back. "I'm not from around here originally." Eleanor nodded, filing away the information along with her growing sense that this young man was carrying secrets that weighed more than his slight frame should have been able to bear. "Well, Marcus, if you ever need help finding resources or just want someone to talk to, I'm usually here Tuesday through Saturday. Art's been a passion of mine since college. I minored in studio art before discovering that I preferred helping other people find what they needed. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and Marcus developed a tentative friendship built around shared appreciation for artistic technique and quiet conversation about neutral topics. She learned that he was staying with family friends while attending his senior year at a nearby high school, that he hoped to study art in college, and that he'd moved frequently throughout his childhood due to his father's work in transportation. What she didn't learn, but gradually inferred from his behavior and occasional unguarded comments, was that Marcus was carrying trauma that had shaped his worldview in fundamental ways. He spoke about adults with careful neutrality, never expressing strong positive or negative opinions. He described previous living situations in vague terms that suggested instability and uncertainty. Most tellingly, his artwork, glimpsed briefly when he forgot to cover his sketchpad, depicted architectural spaces and human figures that reminded Eleanor of documentary photographs she'd seen about children in crisis. The revelation came on a Thursday in late April, when Marcus arrived at the library visibly upset. His usual careful composure had cracked, and Eleanor could see that he'd been crying despite his attempts to hide it behind the hood of his sweatshirt. "Marcus?" Eleanor approached his table with the kind of gentle concern she'd perfected over 3 decades of working with people in distress. "Is everything all right?" He shook his head, staring down at his hands folded on the table. "I saw something on the news. A story about missing kids. About this big investigation. It reminded me of some things." Eleanor sat down across from him, her library training kicking in. She'd learned when to push for information and when to simply provide a safe space for people to share what they were ready to share. "Do you want to talk about it?" Marcus was quiet for several minutes, occasionally glancing around the library as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. Finally, he opened his sketchpad and turned it toward Eleanor, revealing a drawing that took her breath away. The image showed a basement space rendered in meticulous detail, concrete walls, exposed ceiling beams, hanging light bulbs, positioned at specific angles. But it was the human elements that made Eleanor's chest tighten with recognition and horror. Small figures huddled in corners, adult shapes looming in doorways, architectural details that suggested confinement rather than shelter. "I used to draw pictures like this when I was younger," Marcus said quietly. "Different places, but similar situations. I thought maybe if I drew what was happening, someone would understand what I couldn't say out loud." Eleanor studied the drawing, her mind racing through 30 years of helping library patrons find information about difficult topics. She'd assisted parents researching signs of abuse, students working on projects about child welfare, social workers looking for resources about trauma recovery. She recognized the visual language Marcus was using, understood the significance of his artistic documentation. "Marcus," she said carefully, "have you ever talked to anyone official about these experiences? A counselor, or a police officer, or someone from Child Protective Services?" He shook his head. "Too complicated. Too many people involved, too many places, and I wasn't the only one. There were other kids all the time, coming and going. Some of them were really young, like 7 or 8 years old. They had this look in their eyes, like they'd seen too much but learned to stay quiet about it." Eleanor felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. She thought about news stories she'd read about child trafficking, about FBI investigations into exploitation networks, about children who disappeared and were never found. "Marcus, I think you should talk to someone who can help. Not just with what happened to you, but with information that might help other children." "I don't know." Marcus said, closing the sketch pad. I've been moving around for years, trying to get far enough away that they won't find me. I finally feel sort of safe here, sort of normal. If I talk to cops, if I get involved in some big investigation. Eleanor understood his hesitation, but she also understood that Marcus possessed information that could potentially save other children from experiences similar to his own. What if I made some phone calls first? She suggested. I know people in social services, people who specialize in helping young adults who've been through traumatic situations. We could explore your options without committing to anything specific. That evening, Eleanor stayed late at the library, using her computer to research federal agencies that handled child trafficking cases. She found contact information for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and for FBI field offices that specialized in crimes against children. She also reached out to colleagues who worked in social services, asking for referrals to therapists and advocates who had experience with trafficking survivors. Before leaving the library, Eleanor made photocopies of the drawing Marcus had shown her, along with notes about their conversation. She locked the copies in her desk drawer, unsure whether she'd ever need them, but understanding instinctively that Marcus's artwork represented evidence of something larger and more terrible than she'd initially realized. As she walked to her car in the library parking lot, Eleanor found herself thinking about all the young people who'd passed through the library over the years, all the stories she'd helped them research, all the questions she'd helped them answer. For the first time in her career, she felt the weight of knowing more than she knew how to handle, of holding information that could change lives if she made the right decisions, or destroy trust if she moved too quickly. Marcus was scheduled to return on Tuesday, and Eleanor knew she had the weekend to decide how to proceed. She also knew that somewhere, in files and folders and computer databases, there were law enforcement officers who had been looking for exactly the kind of information that Marcus carried in his memories and his artwork. The question was whether she could convince him that speaking up was worth the risk. Not just for his own healing, but for all the other children whose stories remained locked in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to break the quiet game that had kept them hidden for so long. Eleanor Matthews spent her weekend researching federal protocols for reporting suspected child trafficking, reading survivor testimonies, and carefully considering how to approach the most important conversation of her 32-year library career. She called in sick on Monday, something she'd done fewer than 5 times in 3 decades, and used the day to contact advocacy organizations that specialized in supporting trafficking survivors. By Tuesday afternoon, when Marcus arrived at his usual table, Eleanor had assembled a carefully curated list of resources and contact information. She'd also spoken with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a trauma therapist who worked with the regional FBI office to support survivors during investigations. Dr. Walsh had agreed to meet with Marcus informally, with no obligation to report information unless he specifically consented to participate in an investigation. Marcus, Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from him, I spent some time over the weekend thinking about our conversation last week. I want you to know that whatever you decide to do, I'll support you. But I also want to make sure you have all the information you need to make that decision. Marcus looked up from his sketch pad, where he'd been working on a new drawing, this one showing a highway rest stop viewed from the perspective of someone watching from a vehicle window. What kind of information? Eleanor spread several pamphlets and printed articles across the table. Information about your rights, about what happens when survivors choose to share their stories with law enforcement, about the kinds of support and protection that are available, and information about ongoing investigations that might be related to your experiences. She watched Marcus's expression carefully as she explained what she'd learned about federal trafficking investigations, about how survivor testimony was collected and protected, about the ways that speaking up could potentially help other children, while also providing resources for his own recovery and education. There's an FBI agent named David Park who's been working on cases involving children who disappeared from Pennsylvania and surrounding states, Eleanor said quietly. Some of those children created artwork very similar to yours before they went missing. The investigators think there might be connections between multiple cases. Marcus went very still, his pencil frozen above the paper. What kind of artwork? Eleanor had brought photocopies of news articles about the investigation, carefully selected to provide information without revealing details that might compromise ongoing law enforcement activities. She showed Marcus a photograph of drawings that had been released to the public as part of an appeal for information. Basement spaces, architectural details, human figures positioned in ways that suggested confinement or hiding. These look familiar, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The investigator thinks these drawings were created by children who experienced similar situations to what you've described. Some of those children are still missing. Others, like you, managed to get away but haven't felt safe enough to come forward. Marcus studied the photocopied images for several minutes, occasionally glancing at his own artwork as if comparing details. Eleanor could see him processing connections, recognizing elements that confirmed her suspicions about the scope of what he'd survived. "If I talk to this FBI guy," Marcus said finally, "what happens then? Do I have to go to court? Do I have to see those people again?" Eleanor had anticipated these questions and had prepared answers based on her conversations with Dr. Walsh and victim advocates. It depends on what you're comfortable with and what information you have. Some survivors choose to provide written statements or recorded interviews without ever having to appear in court. Others decide to participate more fully in the investigation and prosecution process. The important thing is that you get to control how much you share and when. She explained the concept of victim advocates, professionals whose job was to support survivors throughout the legal process and ensure their rights were protected. She described safe house programs and witness protection services that could provide security for individuals whose testimony put them at risk. Most importantly, she emphasized that deciding to speak with investigators didn't obligate him to participate in prosecution efforts if he later decided the costs were too high. "I need to think about it," Marcus said, carefully closing his sketchpad. "Can I take these pamphlets with me?" "Of course, and Marcus, Dr. Walsh, the therapist I mentioned, has an office about 6 blocks from here. She's agreed to meet with you informally, just to talk about your options and answer any questions you might have. No pressure, no official reporting, unless you decide that's what you want." Eleanor wrote Dr. Walsh's contact information on a library bookmark and handed it to Marcus, along with the advocacy materials. "Take your time. Think about what feels right for you, but also remember that your story, your artwork, your survival, all of that has value beyond what was done to you. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to let the people who hurt us keep us silent." That evening, Eleanor called Agent Park's office and left a carefully worded message indicating that she had information relevant to his investigation and requesting a return call. She didn't mention Marcus by name or provide specific details, but she wanted to establish contact in case he decided to move forward. Park called her back within 2 hours, his voice reflecting the controlled urgency of someone who'd been working a difficult case for months without significant breaks. Eleanor explained her role as a librarian, her relationship with Marcus, and the general nature of the information he possessed, emphasizing his need for control over the process and protection of his privacy. "Mrs. Matthews," Park said, "I want you to know that we've been hoping someone like your young friend would come forward. We have evidence suggesting that multiple children were exploited by the same network, but we've been missing the human element, survivor testimony that could help us understand how the operation worked and where other victims might be found. What happens if he decides to talk to you?" Park explained the FBI's protocols for working with trafficking survivors, the resources available for their protection and support, and the ways that survivor testimony was integrated into broader investigations without putting individuals at unnecessary risk. He also provided Eleanor with his direct contact information and encouraged her to call with any questions or concerns that might arise. "One more thing," Park said before ending the call. "If your friend created artwork documenting his experiences, that could be incredibly valuable evidence. Visual documentation often captures details that verbal testimony misses, and it can help us identify locations and methods that connect multiple cases." After the call, Eleanor sat in her small apartment, surrounded by the notes and printouts she'd accumulated over the weekend, thinking about the weight of the decision Marcus was facing. She understood why survivors might choose silence over the uncertainty and potential re-traumatization of legal proceedings. But she also understood that silence allowed perpetrators to continue operating, allowed other children to experience what Marcus and Ethan Walsh and so many others had endured. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at work early and spent time before the library opened, preparing a small, private space where Marcus could make phone calls or meet with advocates without interruption. She gathered additional resources about trauma recovery, college financial aid for trafficking survivors, and career counseling services that specialized in helping young adults rebuild their lives after exploitation. When Marcus arrived at his usual time on Thursday afternoon, Eleanor could see that he'd been thinking about their conversation. His sketchpad was fuller than usual, as if he'd been working intensively over the past 2 days, and he carried himself with a different kind of determination than she'd seen before. "I want to talk to Dr. Walsh first," he said, settling into his chair, "and maybe, if that goes okay, I might be ready to talk to the FBI guy. But I have conditions." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the moment when someone decided to reclaim their agency after years of having choices made for them by other people. What conditions? I want to see what they already know before I tell them anything new. I want to know exactly who else is involved in the investigation. And I want some kind of guarantee that if I help them, they'll help me figure out what happened to some of the other kids I knew. Kids who were younger than me who might not have gotten away. Eleanor nodded, understanding that Marcus's conditions reflected both his need for control and his recognition that survival carried responsibilities to those who hadn't been as fortunate. I think those are very reasonable requests. Should I call Dr. Walsh and see if she can meet with you this week? Marcus opened his sketch pad and began sketching while Eleanor made the phone call, his pencil moving across the paper with practiced efficiency. When she finished arranging the appointment, she looked over to see that he'd drawn a doorway opening onto bright sunlight, with a small figure stepping across the threshold from darkness into light. It was the first hopeful image she'd seen in any of his artwork, and she took it as a sign that Marcus Rivera was finally ready to stop hiding and start healing. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's office occupied the third floor of a converted Victorian house, 6 blocks from the Carnegie Library, its tall windows offering views of Pittsburgh's skyline while maintaining the intimate atmosphere of a residential space. When Marcus arrived for his appointment on Friday afternoon, he found Eleanor waiting in the small reception area, a gesture of support that helped calm the anxiety that had been building since he'd agreed to this meeting. Dr. Walsh was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of calm presence that suggested extensive experience working with people who'd learned to be wary of adults. She offered Marcus coffee or tea, showed him around her office space, and explained her role as both a trauma therapist and a consultant to federal investigators. Before we talk about anything specific, Dr. Walsh said, settling into a chair across from Marcus rather than behind her desk, I want you to understand exactly what this conversation is and what it isn't. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions, to understand your options, and to decide what feels safe and right for you. I won't be taking notes unless you ask me to, and I won't be sharing anything you tell me unless you specifically request that I do so. Marcus nodded, his sketchpad clutched in his lap like a shield. Eleanor said you work with the FBI. Does that mean you're required to report things? Only if you're in immediate danger, or if you specifically ask me to share information with investigators. My primary obligation is to you and your well-being, not to any investigation. Dr. Walsh's voice carried the kind of certainty that comes from years of establishing trust with vulnerable clients. What questions do you have about the legal process, or about what happens when survivors choose to share their experiences with law enforcement? For the next hour, Marcus asked detailed questions about witness protection, about how survivor testimony was used in prosecutions, about the timeline of investigations and the likelihood of successful outcomes. Dr. Walsh answered each question thoroughly, providing examples from other cases while maintaining client confidentiality, helping Marcus understand both the potential benefits and risks of coming forward. I keep thinking about the other kids, Marcus said eventually. Kids who were younger than me, who might still be trapped in that situation. If there's a chance that talking to investigators could help find them, then I think I have to do it. But I'm scared that if I start talking about what happened, I'll fall apart and won't be able to function anymore. Dr. Walsh leaned forward slightly, her expression reflecting both understanding and professional confidence. Trauma recovery isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't affect you. It's about learning to carry those experiences in ways that don't overwhelm your capacity to build the life you want. Speaking about your experiences in a controlled, supported environment is often an important part of that process. She explained how trauma-informed interviewing worked, how investigators trained specifically to work with trafficking survivors could collect information without re-traumatizing witnesses. She described the resources available to support survivors throughout legal proceedings and beyond. Therapy services, educational support, housing assistance, career counseling. What about my artwork? Marcus asked, opening his sketchpad to reveal pages of detailed drawings. Eleanor mentioned that visual documentation could be helpful to investigators. Dr. Walsh studied the drawings with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen similar documentation from other survivors. The architectural details, the perspective from hiding places, the way Marcus had captured the emotional weight of confinement and exploitation, all of it spoke to experiences that investigators had been trying to understand and document. This is remarkable work, she said quietly, not just artistically, but as documentation of experiences that are usually hidden from outside observation. If you're comfortable sharing these with investigators, they could provide crucial evidence about locations, methods, and the scope of the operation you survived. Marcus turned through several pages, pointing out details that corresponded to specific memories. This one shows the basement where they kept us most of the time. This one is the truck stop where they'd take us sometimes. And this one. He paused at a drawing that showed multiple small figures arranged in a semicircle, their faces turned away from the viewer. This is from a place where there were a lot of other kids. I think it was some kind of hub, where they'd bring children from different places before moving them somewhere else. Dr. Walsh recognized the significance of what Marcus was describing. Hub locations were critical to understanding how trafficking networks operated, but they were notoriously difficult for investigators to identify without survivor testimony and documentation. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I think your information could be incredibly valuable to the ongoing investigation. But I also want to make sure you're prepared for what cooperation with federal investigators involves. It's not a decision you can easily reverse once you've started the process." They spent another 30 minutes discussing the practical aspects of working with the FBI, the interview process, the types of questions investigators would ask, the timeline for providing information and reviewing evidence. Dr. Walsh also explained how survivor testimony was protected during court proceedings and what resources were available if Marcus experienced trauma responses during interviews or depositions. "I'd like to meet with Agent Park," Marcus said finally, "but I want you there when I talk to him, and I want Eleanor there too if she's willing. They're the only adults I've trusted in years, and I think I'll need that support." Dr. Walsh agreed to arrange the meeting and to participate as Marcus's advocate throughout the process. She also provided him with her emergency contact information and scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week, recognizing that deciding to cooperate with investigators often triggered anxiety and trauma responses that required ongoing support. When Marcus and Eleanor left Dr. Walsh's office that afternoon, Eleanor could see that the weight of decision-making had been lifted from his shoulders. He walked with more confidence, spoke with greater clarity about his plans for the future, and seemed to have found some peace with the choice he'd made. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor asked as they walked back toward the library. "No," Marcus replied honestly, "but I'm sure that staying silent hasn't protected me or anyone else, and I'm sure that if there's a chance my information could help find some of those other kids, I have to try." That evening, Dr. Walsh called Agent Park to arrange the meeting. Park's response was immediate and professional. He could meet with Marcus whenever the young man felt ready, at whatever location felt safest, with whatever support people he needed present. The investigation had been waiting for exactly this kind of break, and Park understood the importance of creating conditions that would help Marcus feel secure enough to share what he knew. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Dr. Walsh's office, a neutral location where Marcus felt comfortable and protected. Park would bring minimal documentation and only one colleague, keeping the initial interview informal and focused on establishing trust rather than gathering detailed evidence. Over the weekend, Marcus continued working on his artwork, creating new drawings that documented locations and experiences he'd never tried to capture before. The process was emotionally difficult, but also cathartic, a way of transforming traumatic memories into evidence that could potentially prevent other children from experiencing similar exploitation. By Monday evening, Marcus had filled an entire sketchpad with detailed documentation of his experiences. The drawings told a story that stretched across multiple states and several years, revealing the scope and sophistication of the network that had trafficked him and numerous other children. As he prepared for Tuesday's meeting with Agent Park, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that his survival might serve a purpose larger than simply escaping his past. For the first time since Eleanor had approached him at the library, he allowed himself to hope that speaking up might actually make a difference. Agent David Park arrived at Dr. Walsh's office on Tuesday morning, carrying a briefcase that contained 9 years of investigative files, evidence photos, and documentation from missing children cases across 6 states. He'd spent the weekend reviewing everything the FBI had compiled about trafficking networks operating along East Coast trucking corridors, preparing for what might be the most important interview of his career. Marcus was already seated in Dr. Walsh's office when Park arrived, flanked by Eleanor and Dr. Walsh, his sketchpad open on the coffee table between them. The young man looked older than his 16 years, with the kind of watchful composure that Park had seen in other trafficking survivors, children who'd learned to read adult intentions and respond accordingly. "Marcus," Park said, settling into the chair that Dr. Walsh indicated. "I want to start by thanking you for being willing to speak with me. I know this isn't easy, and I want you to know that you're in control of this conversation. We'll only talk about what you're comfortable discussing, and we can stop anytime you need a break." Park had been trained in trauma-informed interviewing techniques, understanding that traditional interrogation methods were not only ineffective with trafficking survivors, but could cause additional psychological harm. His approach was conversational, allowing Marcus to tell his story in his own words while gently guiding him toward information that might be relevant to the investigation. "Dr. Walsh told me you have evidence from other cases," Marcus said. "Could I see some of that before I tell you my story? I want to understand what you already know." Park opened his briefcase and spread a selection of photographs across the coffee table. Images of locations, evidence photos from crime scenes, and copies of artwork created by other missing children. He watched Marcus's reaction carefully, noting which images prompted recognition and which seemed to trigger trauma responses. Marcus studied the photographs for several minutes, occasionally pointing to details that caught his attention. When he reached the copies of Ethan Walsh's drawings, he went very still. "I knew this kid," Marcus said quietly, pointing to one of Ethan's sketches. "Not his name, but I remember him. He was really young, maybe 7 or 8 when I saw him. He was at the place I drew here." Marcus turned to a page in his sketch pad that showed a basement space with concrete walls and exposed ceiling beams. "This is the same room where they kept him for a while." Park felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with major breakthroughs in difficult cases. "Can you tell me about that location, where it was, how you got there, who was responsible for bringing children there?" Over the next 3 hours, with breaks for water and bathroom visits when Marcus needed to step away from the intensity of remembering, a comprehensive picture emerged of a trafficking operation that had been moving children across state lines for at least a decade. Marcus's testimony, combined with his detailed artwork, provided the missing pieces that investigators had been seeking for years. The operation was more sophisticated than Park had initially suspected. Children were recruited from vulnerable situations: homeless youth, kids aging out of foster care, families in crisis who couldn't adequately supervise their children. They were moved frequently between multiple locations, preventing them from forming attachments or developing detailed knowledge of any single place. "The man who ran everything, we just called him Mr. Frank," Marcus explained, creating a sketch of an adult figure while he talked. "He wasn't around much, but when he was, everyone was extra careful to follow the rules. The kids who'd been there longest would warn the new ones about what happened if you tried to run away, or if you broke the quiet game. The quiet game was a system of psychological control that prevented children from talking about their experiences, even to each other, speaking about anything related to their situation. Asking questions about the outside world, or expressing desire to leave, resulted in punishment that was severe enough to ensure compliance from even very young children. Ethan, the little boy whose drawings you showed me, he had a hard time with the quiet game at first," Marcus remembered. "He kept asking about his mom, kept trying to draw pictures of his house. They put him in isolation until he learned to stop talking about the outside." Marcus's information allowed Park to construct a timeline of Ethan Walsh's captivity that corresponded with witness reports and evidence from the original investigation. More importantly, it provided details about the transportation methods, the other individuals involved in the operation, and the network of locations where children had been held. "There was a truck driver named Bobby who transported kids between different places," Marcus said, sketching while he spoke. "He had this CB radio handle, Night Rider, and he talked to other drivers about special cargo that needed to be moved quietly. I rode in his truck 4 different times over 2 years." Park took careful notes about the transportation network, recognizing that trucking industry records might provide the paper trail that had been missing from the investigation. CB radio communications, fuel purchase records, and electronic logging data could potentially be used to track movements and identify other participants in the trafficking operation. As the interview continued, Marcus provided information about dozens of other children he'd encountered during his time in the trafficking network. Some had been as young as 5 or 6. Others were teenagers like himself. Most had disappeared into the system, without leaving traces that conventional investigations could follow. "The worst part wasn't what they did to us," Marcus said during one of their breaks, staring out Dr. Walsh's window at the Pittsburgh skyline. "The worst part was knowing that it was happening to other kids too, and feeling like there was no way to help them or get word to anyone on the outside about what was really going on." By the end of the interview, Park had enough information to request federal warrants from multiple locations, to begin tracking financial records associated with the shell companies that owned properties in the network, and to coordinate with other federal agencies that handled trucking industry oversight and interstate commerce violations. Most importantly, Marcus's testimony provided hope that some of the missing children might still be alive and recoverable. The trafficking operation had been designed for long-term exploitation rather than immediate harm, suggesting that children who'd been reported missing years earlier might still be held at locations that investigators could now identify and target. Marcus, Park said as they prepared to end the interview, "I want you to know that what you've shared today is going to help us find other children and hopefully prevent this from happening to anyone else. You've been incredibly brave, and the information you've provided is exactly what we needed to move this investigation forward." Over the following weeks, as federal agencies coordinated raids on multiple locations and began arrests of individuals involved in the trafficking network, Marcus worked with Dr. Walsh to process the emotional impact of speaking about his experiences. The healing process would be long and complex, but for the first time since his escape, he felt like his survival had meaning beyond simply getting away. Eleanor continued to provide support and advocacy, helping Marcus navigate educational opportunities and financial assistance programs for trafficking survivors. She also worked with Agent Park to establish a fund that would support other survivors who came forward with information about the network. 3 months after Marcus's interview, federal investigators announced the largest trafficking bust in Pennsylvania history. 17 adults were arrested, 4 major facilities were shut down, and 12 children were recovered from situations of exploitation and abuse. Among those recovered was a young man named Thomas Chen, who'd been reported missing from Maryland in 2018, and who'd been creating artwork similar to Marcus's throughout his captivity. But the case that drew the most media attention was the discovery of evidence that finally explained what had happened to Ethan Walsh. DNA evidence found at one of the raided facilities confirmed that he'd been held there for several months after his disappearance in 2014. While Ethan himself wasn't among the children recovered in the raids, investigators found detailed records that documented his movement through the trafficking network and provided his family with the first concrete information about his fate. Claire Walsh received the news about Ethan on a cold morning in December 2023, 9 years after her son had disappeared from Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Detective Kim drove to her house personally to deliver the information, bringing with her copies of records that showed Ethan had survived for at least 18 months after his disappearance, that he'd been moved between multiple locations, and that other children remembered him as someone who'd tried to protect younger victims even when it put him at risk. The news was devastating and relieving in equal measure. Claire finally had answers about what had happened to her son, but those answers revealed experiences that no mother should have to imagine her child enduring. What provided some comfort was learning that Ethan's artistic documentation of his experiences had ultimately contributed to the investigation that dismantled the network responsible for his disappearance. As the legal proceedings continued and more survivors came forward with their stories, the community of people affected by the trafficking network began to form connections based on shared experience and mutual support. Marcus became an advocate for other survivors, using his artwork and his voice to raise awareness about trafficking and to push for better resources for children aging out of exploitive situations. Eleanor Matthews received recognition from the American Library Association for her role in supporting a trafficking survivor and contributing to the investigation that led to the network's dismantling. But the recognition she valued most came from Marcus himself, who continued to visit the Carnegie Library every Tuesday and Thursday, now working on artwork that documented healing and hope rather than trauma and exploitation. Dr. Walsh expanded her practice to focus exclusively on trafficking survivors, developing new therapeutic approaches that incorporated artistic expression and survivor advocacy into traditional trauma treatment. She often used Marcus's case as an example of how creating safe spaces for survivors to share their stories could lead to both individual healing and systemic change. The investigation revealed that the trafficking network had operated for more than 15 years, moving hundreds of children through a system designed to keep them invisible to law enforcement and social services. The sentences handed down to those convicted ranged from 15 years to life in prison, sending a clear message that child exploitation would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. For Claire Walsh, the resolution of the investigation brought a complex mixture of closure and ongoing grief. She knew now what had happened to Ethan, understood that his disappearance wasn't the result of anything she'd done or failed to do, and had evidence that he'd tried to protect other children even in the most horrific circumstances. But she also knew that Ethan was gone. that the little boy who'd collected smooth stones and drawn pictures of houses with crooked chimneys would never come home to the bedroom where his artwork still hung on the walls like messages from a lost world. In the months following the arrests and trials, Claire became involved with organizations that supported families of missing children, sharing her story at conferences and training sessions where law enforcement officers learned to recognize signs of trafficking and exploitation. She often carried copies of Ethan's drawings, using them to illustrate how children sometimes communicate about experiences they can't describe in words. Marcus Rivera graduated from high school with honors and received a full scholarship to study art therapy at Carnegie Mellon University. His senior project was a series of large-scale paintings that documented the journey from trauma to healing, from silence to advocacy, from isolation to community. The final painting in the series showed a group of children standing in bright sunlight, their faces turned toward the viewer with expressions of hope and determination. At the bottom of the canvas, in careful lettering that matched the style of his childhood drawings, Marcus had written, "For all the children who are still learning to speak." If stories like Marcus's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.